Hello, everybody. Here is Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. And with me today is Albert Świdziński, Director of Analysis at Strategy and Future. We're based in Warsaw, as you know, Poland. And Albert and I today will try to touch, to discuss the issue of primacy, United States primacy in the world, and whether it's ebbing, especially from Eurasia or not, and what it means for us. Hi, Albert. How are you?
Hi, Jacek. I'm good. How are you?
I'm also fine. Although
my turtleneck, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, it's just the beginning of January. It's always very difficult to get back to work after New Year's Eve and probably Christmas. So let's get started. So at Strategy and Future, we have been debating internally for a long time whether the United States, first of all, wants to sustain its primacy over world affairs, with all implications if it wants. And the second, whether it has a material capabilities to sustain, because as you well know, our audience well knows, it doesn't have to go parallel. Sometimes there is a major miscalculation upon the decision makers in great powers that they think they can sustain primacy or dominance over at least some regions of the world. And in fact, it is tested, and in test shows that they cannot. And they have no sufficient material forces to sustain, to support the claim for primacy. And let's start our discussion from this point. Biden had a speech, around this Gaza thing. He had a speech that the United States is going to be an arsenal of democracy, which means that it will deliver weapons to both Ukraine and Israel, and it will sustain the global order probably elsewhere. And here, because we are based in Poland, the extreme boundaries of the American global oceanic empire, to put it in the purely geopolitical terms, we are much preoccupied whether they can walk the talk. Basically, the United States really has sufficient capabilities to really support the claim. And of course, that pertains not only to the material forces, but also to credibility issue, to the Poland stance, how we reform the military, how we position ourselves, how European Union reacts, how our neighborhood reacts, how Western Pacific reacts, the global economic order reacts. This is a dynamo situation. So Albert, how would you start this as a Strategy and Future? You are the foremost person dealing with this primacy thing. How would you set out for this voyage, discussing the United States primacy and whether it's ebbing away, whether they're moving towards selective engagement or maybe offshore balancing? What is your take on that?
Well, maybe let's start, because I think you framed it right with those first two questions you asked, whether it wants to and whether it can uphold its grand strategy, because that's what it really is, a grand strategy of primacy. And to answer it shortly, I think it does want to, and I think it absolutely cannot uphold the primacy. Now, to get maybe into a bit of a detail,
maybe I have a question already, Albert. What it means that it wants? Do you think that
exactly,
there's sort of imperial party? And
I mean, look, the US has pursued primacy as a grand strategy, let's say from 1990, from the collapse of Soviet Union. Before that, it was one of the two great powers, and it pursued onshore balancing to ensure that the threat from the USSR emanating from the USSR is contained. Ever since 1990, with the unipolar moment, the end of history, and so on and so forth, it decided, even though there was an internal debate in the United States whether it should adopt this very ambitious posture, it elected to do so. And it's understandable. In a most basic level, it is understandable that it sought to maximize its influence and role and outsized influence in international affairs. And I think this is also the reason why most of US policymaking elites will want to uphold its role. It is simply because it is primus inter pares. It is far above everybody else, even though the narrative that that is served with the US international order is that everybody's equal. That of course is not the case. That there are more and less equal partners within the order. And the idea that the US would step down from its position of preponderance willingly and accept that it is not the first among equals is just a very difficult, very difficult idea to swallow for anybody. And I mean, if you look at not necessarily at states, but if you look at how organizations behave, do they willingly step down from position of monopoly? No. Do people and organizations willingly step down? Usually it doesn't happen. Do animals in group animals, have you ever seen an old lion willingly step down from position of being an alpha male? It almost never happens.
Yeah, but
and also if you look at the bureaucracy, what is the mental mindset? What is the mindset of, say, the State Department, of people who were raised usually and have most of their living experiences coming from the 90s onwards? Would those people be willing to pursue a policy that would willingly give it up ahead of time? It's it's a difficult concept.
Let me challenge you on that a little bit, Albert, maybe for the richness of our conversation. There are people like, for example, Elbridge Colby, who I think aims for select engagement, so sort of the withdrawal from the primacy. Wes Mitchell as well, I think, he posits the selective engagement. The Trump's people from the Trump's camp apparently talk about selective engagement or even offshore balancing. That is labeled as isolationism, but it's not isolationism. Basically, it's offshore balancing or selective engagement. And in the past, in the history of great powers, there were many examples of at least withdrawing from regional primacy. The United Kingdom withdrawing from Asia Pacific, basically after the First World War, allowing Japan to some concessions, and also prior to the First World War, because of the German threat, United Kingdom, Great Britain both ceded some space, strategic space, to both the United States and Japan, far away from the clash with Germany. Also, after Suez moment, the Great Britain withdrew from the Indian Ocean and out further reaches of its former empire, also is Oceanic Empire. There were instances, Habsburg Empire.
There are precedents. If you look, to be honest, if you look at, you mentioned Elbridge Colby and Wes Mitchell, but if you look at early or mid 90s, and this is basically what is under umbrella term restrainers, people or people who follow more restrained foreign policy in the United States. Look, even Obama had those ambitions. Quite frankly, it wasn't just Trump; it was Obama as well. And as Obama said, and I think his last interview as a president, or one just after he ended presidency, he said that he was at the end defeated by the blob. I don't know if you remember this interview, but it was, I think, 2012. So basically, either going concern of the United States or mindset of the elites made it impossible for him to follow his ideas for his presidency, and he wanted to limit U.S. exposure in the world. Those cases you mentioned are true. Some of them more true than others. I mean, the U.S. or the United Kingdom after Second World War, after Suez, it was sort of, it was facts on the ground forced it to do so. It wasn't just its farsightedness. It was an objective fact where, it basically ceased being empire after ships for bases, right? And
you mean,
sort of accepting that
the Second World War,
the cousins,
yeah.
So there is that. If, to be honest, if you were looking at an example of a state willingly stepping down from its position, I think it would, ahead of time, I suppose, USSR would be an interesting case study, where, you know, they were obviously losing. They knew they were losing, but they were still a great power. And yet, in late 80s, starting from mid 80s, I suppose, up to late 80s, early 90s, they reached the conclusion that this is unsustainable, and they stepped down. So it happens, but it's rare. It is rare. And whether it can, coming back to your second question, whether it can uphold its primacy, I'm willing to say there is no way in hell for the United States to uphold its primacy. It's a deeply ahistorical outcome that it witnessed. And also the way primacy works, international system works, there is sort of self-destruct mechanism involved in it. From the fact that, because we have to discuss what primacy actually means in practical terms. There are three elements to, I suppose, to the way the US has set up international order after the Second World War. And that was the policy of containment against the USSR, establishing a system which fosters freedom of strategic flows, of commercial exchange, free markets. And then the third one was inhibition of the spread of nuclear weapons. But if you look at the key one, and then the US, of course, set up the norms, set up the entire normative structure that supports its interests. In terms of norms, you know, it's basically the rules-based international order now. Used to be international law-based, but now it's rules-based. The thing is, and of course, upholding stability globally.
Because this is what
initially
people don't understand. Could you explain the difference of the United States primacy adversaries, or at least people that sort of challenge this concept of U.S. primacy? What's the difference between international law and rule-based order?
And look, I think you're putting me on the spot here. It's a dangerous topic to touch upon, because you can easily swerve into the way.
So I can.
Go ahead, do it.
Okay. So basically, international order is the United Nations stuff, all the charter that were signed up to following the results and outcomes of the Second World War. While rules-based order, which sometimes is confused as the same as the international order, is the order that the United States as a hegemon empire impose on trade and flows and sort of the security architecture. And these are the foundation upon which the globalization was established and founded and carried through. So there is this moral element in it, and also a sort of the manipulative argument that rules-based order, which is the Western values, the Western order, and the capitalist system that operates and supply chains that are the execution of the system, are sort of modeled as people in the West wish, especially.
Also, the rules seems to fluctuate, because
exactly.
They're just rules. They change, but
the interpretation, the changes. And this is a valid claim by the global South, trying to expand the old capitalist system of only Western world, and it's sort of the global supply chains.
But also, going back, look, primacy has a self-destruct mechanism involved in it, because the United States seeks to provide, or there is a positive feedback between trying to create free international system when it comes to economic exchange and the way it stabilizes the international system. But also, the only way for this system to emerge, like a Bretton Woods free exchange system to emerge, is you have to ensure stability. So in a way, the United States, even though in theory it has to uphold presence in three parts of the world, Middle East, Europe, and East Asia, ultimately, and this is the experience of the US for the past 30 years, constantly involved in wars, is that it has to not only ensure stability in those core areas, those three core areas, but it also increasingly has to stabilize peripheries. And those are Afghanistan's, Iraq's, Ukraine, I'm afraid, to an extent as well. So it forces US to overstretch and overextend continuously to ensure stability, which in turn allows the system of free economic exchange. And this constantly saps up the US power. Also, the fact that a multitude of states, including potential challengers, are a part of this free market international system, also in itself leads to the US being relatively weaker economically, inevitably, because those states that challenge it were weaker economically. Their economic growth will be faster, and faster still when they are part of globalized economic system than that of the United States. And lastly, to have that system in place, the US also provides the global reserve exchange medium currency, right? Which in turn, it has become one of the main exports of the United States. But that has an adverse effect, a significant adverse effect on its industrial capacity. It offshores it abroad. It becomes too expensive to produce in the United States. And also the tenet of the international economic order, the way it was that you allocate capital according to optimization theory, right? To comparative advantages and so on. So essentially that leads to the US being hollowed out in terms of industry and focusing on financial services, very much similar to UK before World War One. UK wasn't really it was an industrial powerhouse, but it was smaller than the US and Germany, Imperial Germany. So this is a similar process in a way. And you see the US, you see attack on that order, not only coming from Russia's and China's of the world, but also from the US itself. The US itself is dismantling the order when it comes to free economic exchange. There are no more FTAs, right? And it's been stated very clearly by the highest ranking members of the US, of the Biden administration, that there will be no more free trade deals. So they themselves are eroding the international order they created because it doesn't serve their interests. And even if that erosion is not a result of a conscious planning to move away from primacy, the facts on the ground sort of direct the US policy away from upholding.
Yeah, let alone that the United States is located in North America without major enemies in the continent, protected by two modes of Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, with all mineral resources, almost all of them that they wish to have, with great population, rivers, harbors, and everything they need to really make ends meet and be an affluent society. And nuclear weapons and navy. Affluent society without having to deal with the Eurasian matters. And of course, it brings a lot of pain to me when I talk about it, because my dear Poland, where I repeat, we are located with Albert as we record this conversation, has benefited enormously from the United States presence in Eurasia, and we would like the primacy to continue. But the hope and the wish is not the best strategy, so to speak. So we in Poland need to prepare ourselves for the shift. Although, of course, the American politicians visiting Warsaw will be promising everything to keep our impression that primacy is going to stay. And this is the outcome not of their naivety or manipulation, but because the United States credibility and the easiness with which it achieves its political goals in Poland and elsewhere, in the states that are dependent upon the United States providing security, their credibility matters. It's a currency of foreign relations. So they don't want this credibility to collapse or to be fractured by suggesting that, we might withdraw from primacy and you'll be on your own, guys, or at least we will be doing cherry picking when and with whom and on what occasion we want to engage. And then that would be selective engagement strategy or or the offshore balancing.
Yeah.
So the United States has many incentives to pull back from primacy, plus the fear of a great power war with China, basically, might push United States away from this, because there is a difference in resolve. The fate of Taiwan is of completely different meaning for the United States citizens and for the Communist Party in Beijing, which is across to Xiamen, is quite close to from Taiwan, and the also economic interests and so on and so forth. So there is a huge gap of determination, resolve, and the risk between the United States and China. So also the sheer risk of the great power war over some faraway issues might create this proper foundation for the offshore balancing. Maybe. But here kicks in the key issue that you have mentioned is this establishment in DC that has been accustomed to primacy for many decades, and that they want to run the world. And this is sort of some people call it hubris, some people call it narcissism, strategic narcissism. I think there are many, also American strategists that call it that way, and economists also. So it's nothing new to say those words, as we do now. But basically, there is something about it. There's discrepancy between the means and the ends. Albert?
Absolutely. No, yeah, but look again, and this really brings us to three questions I think that are key when you look at, or when you try to answer what's going to happen. Is first of all how the US will abandon primacy. There are multiple ways this could happen. Then the question is what will replace the grand strategy of primacy. Here again, there are three options which you mentioned: offshore balancing, selective engagement, or isolationism. And then another question is what will the US allies do when faced with those challenges? And again, each one of those could be a podcast, but if I could at least throw a couple thoughts and see whether you agree with them or not, or which do you think is the most likely. When it comes to how, again, I don't know, I think we discussed this before in Polish, but I see four potential ways in which the US abandons primacy. And the first one would be to get ahead of the curve, to basically recognize that this is unsustainable, and the US must abandon this brand strategy, replace it with something else. So this would be basically
intellectual process, yes?
Intellectual and very demanding. It would really require not only a thorough intelligence, but also mental fortitude and bravery, to be honest, to do this. Because again, ahead of time, not fully knowing that you're right, you step down from position of primacy. So this would be, kind of what the Soviets.
Plus vested interests of state departments, of the councils of different kinds of DC think tanks, also huge cyber empires, and Silicon Valley global empires of business that want to invest everywhere. They don't want to see the world fracture. They want to see the United States primacy as a sort of the umbrella under which they can operate. Also, Wall Street doesn't want it. Also, people that live off processing the U.S. Treasuries and U.S. money into the world system and supply chain, and sort of inflation being sort of softened up by diversified supply chains. So those beneficiaries of the system will be against them. Will be against it. So East and West Coast might be against it, so to speak. So this is also a political thing in the United States.
Very difficult to do in any system, but democratic especially, I suppose. The second idea I think should be entertained is the US simply ebbing away slowly. So not doing this by design, but rather by facts on the ground without a major conflict erupting. So again, to bring an example of Taiwan, in 40 years. There's no war. The US does not really do what it would take to propose a military answer to the capabilities China has in its littorals and economic capabilities. And rather, it sticks to position of primacy, but it's just increasingly eroding and getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And the Chinese don't really feel the need to break the order like Vladimir Putin attempted to break the order in Ukraine. So basically, they let things play out, and in 40 years, just facts on the ground, fait accompli becomes that the US is not really a primus inter pares, but rather just another member, very powerful, but just another member of international system. So this is another, so ebbing away.
Yeah.
It would require, again, this particular position would require plenty of wisdom from the US's adversaries, so that they don't challenge the US, don't lead to a hot conflict, and rather let the US sort of falter away on its own. Difficult to achieve, I suppose, this one. The third one would be a rapid break. For example, the US losing a peripheral conflict in which it is nonetheless directly engaged. And as a result of this, the US credibility among its allies being shaken up to the extent that they no longer believe the US can be a patron, a security provider. Alternatively, this clean break could happen as a result of turmoil within the United States, internal problems of the US. As we've seen over the last couple of years and last couple of months, quite frankly, the US has a lot on its plate to deal with internally. So perhaps if you see significant turmoil, then this also forces the world to reevaluate the role the US should play, and the US itself. And the fourth one is kind of nasty, because it would involve a direct conflict between the United States and one of its two primary challengers, in Russia or China, where they're directly involved in war, in a kinetic war. And especially over Taiwan, I suppose if the war begins over there for whatever reason, and if the US is directly involved in that conflict, it would be very difficult to keep that conflict under control and keep escalation managed. So we could basically see employment of nuclear weapons, and this is also obviously where the current order ends. So this is the four scenarios. I don't know what's your take on those?
Yeah, I concur. I've known those scenarios that you laid out before internally as Strategy and Future. I think that the ebbing away scenario is the most peaceful one and the most looked forward by the humanity, so to speak.
Except for us, Poles, right?
Except for Poles and the intermarium countries, because that's going to be a vacuum of power in the region, and if we are short on our military capabilities, that's why we want to reform, and that's why what we pose it in Strategy and Future in Paul, to fill in the vacuum. But there will be a vacuum, and that's always very dangerous. So ebbing away is for the humanity is the most prominent, most peaceful. But I think we might have the fourth one, or simply the clash, the war. Maybe not with Russia because of the symmetrical nuclear capabilities, which will keep both parties at bay. There will be only proxy wars. And especially the United States, while moving away from primacy, will, by declarations, start undermining the ironclad Article 5 to impose on the allies to militarize more. So their interest will be to relativize the Article 5, so to speak, to push us to more spending and so on. But I think direct clash with China is highly possible, and even like next year. And the structural forces that drive towards this event are huge, powerful. There are too many asymmetries between them, including the military asymmetry. It may be claimed, as David Goldman claims, that militarily in conventional warfare, the first island chain, China is prevailing. That ups the scale for the United States. So you sort of think that they can resort to the nuclear capabilities, non-strategic, or at least the Chinese might be thinking that they might be doing, and that creates some sort of the Sarajevo moment, kind of Sarajevo moment escalation dynamics, which is very dangerous. That from some incident, situation may quickly evolve to a direct kinetic conflict between naval assets and air assets, and it might be safe. People not living on the the politicians in the opening hours of the conflict might be lured into thinking that it's much easier to control escalation on water, at sea, and in the air than on land where people live. So they might be thinking sort of that, you know what, let's teach those guys a lesson, so that they know. Small encounters, someone destroy against a frigate or something. So, and also, the reason why I'm saying it is that I don't see economic solution to the structural confrontation between the United States and China over global supply chains, over who is the first mover in new industrial revolution domain. I don't see another option, basically. So this is my reaction to what you have said, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'm a bit more skeptical, or a bit less worried about the prospect of a direct war between the US and China. Especially if you look at escalation concerns and war at sea being less escalatory than land warfare. Look at the public's reaction to Ukrainians destroying any vessel of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It immediately hits the front pages. Look, I don't think, because look, again, and also the problem with trying to keep the conflict at a certain level of escalation is problematic, because it is in China's best interest to signal that it will not be willing to control escalation, to manage escalation, right? Just like it was for Russia, just like it's the crux of escalate to de-escalate. The risk is not like a 1-for-1, 1Z2Z exchange of non-strategic nuclear weapons. The threat that really lies at the core of those asymmetric escalation strategies is that the escalation will not be possible to contain. And I think the Chinese will play this card. But this also is the reason why I think the conflict is less likely to erupt. As long as the Taiwanese don't declare independence, it makes all the sense in the world for China to try to bring Taiwan into the fold gradually, knowing the demographics, how many people, over 1 million people work in Taiwan. And it makes on the other hand, it makes all the sense in the world for the US to try to provoke China, to present China as an aggressive power, which should make creating anti-hegemonic coalitions more easily, but at the same time always stop, before staring into the abyss, before crossing the line. I think as long as the Chinese aren't directly concerned about immediate prospect of Taiwan independence, that they would agree to keep the escalation contained somehow.
If I were all leverages of power in DC, just theoretically, I wouldn't risk a global war or kinetic confrontation with China or Russia. I would withdraw from Eurasia. If the Americans really believe that they are so innovative and that they can outcompete in economic terms, so prove it, just prove it without a global war. Let's prove you prove it, guys. Safe behind the moats of oceans. you have the US dollar, prove it. And I would also reconfigure the alliance system in Eurasia, and also maybe proliferation of nuclear weapons would be required to keep the system stable. By stable, I mean protect the former United Allies, or the allies that are left alone, from Russian and Chinese pressure by equipping them with nuclear weapons. And maybe that's, I wonder, I'm really curious what you think. Maybe that would stabilize the system in absence of the United States conventional forces presence.
Because what the United States wants to avoid in this scenario is being entrapped in conflicts.
Yeah.
In which the stakes don't really favor it, but do favor its opponents in Russia or China. And the way to really underpin an anti-hegemonic coalition would be to have nuclear weapons as, a tool that makes power projection nigh impossible or very difficult. So this would make sense in a way. If you remember, non-proliferation was one of the tenets of the US order post-1945, or how it set up the international order. You could pose a question whether even this norm is eroding as well. There are tools. The one is AUKUS, and again, I don't even think we had a little back and forth about this. I don't think it's a conscious effort by the US to underpin this norm, or there is some, secret agreement that this could serve as a segue to Australia having nuclear weapons. Nonetheless, the mere fact that the US is handing this technology over, because basically the reactors that power subs, especially US reactors, because I think French reactors are working on low enriched uranium, but the US reactors are HEU, highly enriched uranium. The mere fact that it's handing over this technology to only second country in history is meaningful. And then there was this agreement between Israel, Saudis, and the US, as a part of which, the Saudis, for normalization of diplomatic relations with Israel, demanded the ability to enrich uranium to control the entire fuel cycle. And the US didn't, reject it out of principle. So that's very interesting. So you could see, and again, even if it won't be US conscious top-down policy, the situation on the ground will force the US increasingly to think about this, to at least consider this. And this is also, mind you, this is a celebrated tradition. Remember, the Chinese helped the Pakistanis build a nuclear weapon to keep India in control, right? So this is a tool of policy in a way.
True, but this is against the conventional wisdom in DC, against many multi-generational anti-proliferation stance that the United States has shown basically since Hiroshima.
For a reason.
Because
providing nuclear extended deterrence really ties you to your allies. It makes them more dependable on you. Of course, it stabilizes. It's less likely, the US has very mature control system over the nuclear weapons. But it also means that your allies have a tangible interest in upkeeping the alliances, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, of course, entrapment, time and time again.
Yeah.
And the more US overextends, and the more there's threat inflation and concerns about credibility, the more US finds itself in a very uncomfortable position where it might be in a conflict where nuclear weapons will be used for reasons other than defending its most basic national existential interests. And this is the problem of primacy the US has now.
Exactly. Exactly. So, in order to one more thing, especially acute moment for the allies located far away from the United States, like Poland, Taiwan, and other countries, is this realization when the moment of transition has started, even if the politicians still lie that it has not, and we can see the tenets of selective engagement or offshore balancing, because there will be this tendency among the client states that we will be manipulated into cushioning all the vacuum of power that the United States is creating and taking, the hardball game on our own without independent control what we're doing. So this is a critically important. For example, that there is war and we don't control our forces because the United States is interested in, as they claim, providing high-end assets. Because of course they want to provide high-end assets, and how the United States military form conventional forces is evolving, so that they control reconnaissance, long-range fires, the sensors, and then we provide other things, including the human factors. And it's not likable here in Warsaw, and basically, and elsewhere, and Taiwanese are playing, I think, the game of cat and mouse with the United States. They pretend that they are modernizing the forces, trying to entrap the United States even more. We, on the other hand, really are trying to modernize our forces, but we are afraid that we would modernize it too well, in a way that there would be a great capability to treat Russian forces, and that would be good enough for the United States not to deter any local conflict that might erupt here, especially that the United States, being in the offshore balancing mode, will not be interested in direct engagement, personal engagement of their own forces. So, very difficult to manage. It's against the mental maps of many folks in DC.
It's a difficult.
Plus, one more thing, Albert, let me say. Plus, I believe that DC folks are not ready to talk like peer to peer with guys like Paul's, talking with competence about such things.
For good reason, to be quite honest. I hate to dish it out to our local elites, but for good reason. There is no. Polish elites don't substantiate this sort of attitude towards them. But this is, I shouldn't.
Yeah, but for the sake of our audience,
yes,
let's to upgrade the level of conversation between the patron state and one of the key allies and the Eastern Front here on NATO Eastern flank. I think that the United States will have to upgrade their sort of level of conversation with Polish elites, because strategically it's a very acute situation, both parties basically.
I mean, the dynamic you spoke of is basically, it's a dodgy dynamic, risky dynamic between abandonment fears on the one hand by the allies and entrapment fears on the other by the client. And they really interact in a nasty way, because the more the US feels a risk of it being entrapped in a conflict it doesn't want to fight, the more it's trying to create a distance. And the more the allies feel that the distance is being created, the more it's possible, doesn't always happen, but it's possible that they will implement policies aimed directly at entrapping its patron, its security guarantor. So you have those two objectives that are really, run counter to one another. So it's a dodgy situation, and you see this happen. Maybe before we end, I'll speak a couple words on case study, which was very interesting, which was Nixon's Guam speech, but maybe a bit later, and how different allies reacted differently to this depending on their security situation, depending on how they subjectively judged how important they are to the United States. It's an interesting case study, because we'll be seeing this process again if we're correct about primacy. But then, of course, going back to those three basic questions, for what the United States will abandon the primacy. So what will be the grand strategy replacing primacy? And I think there you mentioned those three. It's going to be either selective engagement, offshore balancing, or isolationism. Again, the question is which we think is the most likely. The selective engagement is one we hear being spoken a lot about. I think Albert Colby mentioned it a couple times. I don't know. I personally have a problem with the idea of selective engagement, because I see this as a middle of the road solution which doesn't really satisfy any of the requirements the United States might have. And also, selective engagement, first of all, you would have to narrow down to those 2 or 3 regions, or one region really right now, which is East Asia, where you are truly invested in. The problem is there will always be the US will gravitate without a clear cut, and because it's sometimes, primacy wasn't really supposed to be primacy all across the globe. The US was forced to extend its obligations and efforts to stabilize the situation to the periphery. It's just the nature of the beast, right? So the problem of selective engagement is that the US will be time and time again drawn into conflicts that they want to take, and will have to prevent a conflict in the in the core, will have to extend into the periphery. And will be, again, this will be the going concern of the elites, of the military-industrial complex, of everything else. And the US might say it's moving to selective engagement and find itself back where it started 10 years after that, I think that's a problem, selective. We spoke about this when I was going back from Wrocław. I'm sure you remember on the phone.
Yeah.
That's the problem I see with it's murky. The borders are murky, and the US might not be able to execute it in a ruthless way enough to actually do focus only on those areas of selective engagement.
Yeah, I think offshore balancing is the best option for the United States. It creates quite a political and geopolitical maneuvering space for example, for any detente with Russia. That will feel then that will feel acute pressure from China, and their sort of the client patron relationship that is increasing. But putting it aside for a while, I don't understand, and don't know in the offshore balancing mode, in the aftermath of the globalization and then the quick deglobalization. I don't know yet. I haven't thought it through properly. What would that mean for the US dollar system, which is under increased pressure now by the global south and the world, given of course the horrible fiscal state of the United States Treasury, and let's not dive into it even. Of course, often it is rebuffed by the American strategists, but the world is watching, guys, and it's all about credibility and about the 10-year bonds. How they are solvency basically and credibility. I don't know how the offshore balancing would impact the role of the US dollar. Actually, I don't know that yet. We're trying at Strategy&Future to read through books to sort of to the historic context, but there is, I think there is no historical evidence what would happen. Basically, this is a precedent. This will be a precedent kind of a situation.
Look, in the short term, I guess, but I could be horribly wrong, and I might be making a fool out of myself because, again, economics are not my forte. In the short term, it would make sense for the US to uphold the role of the dollar, again, because of the exorbitant privilege, as Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French prime minister, put it. In the long term, however, the US would be looking to work on its fundamentals, rebuild the industrial base. That's going to be a problem for the United States. So it's a less painful solution short term, but more problematic long term. But I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not sure.
I understand.
But the problem of offshore balancing also is that I think, especially people over here, don't fully realize what it means. Because we assume that the US would offshore balance, but still would keep some semblance of presence here. But basically what offshore balancing is simply, it's very narrow. It's far more narrow definition of US existential national interest than primacy. And what it boils down to is ensuring that no power will emerge that will be able to fully dominate, or to a significant extent dominate, those key two regions really in the world, Europe and East Asia. So as long as there is no risk of somebody growing outsized, having outsized power, there is no need to intervene. So the US could either completely ignore the continent or only narrowly impact the balance of power to ensure that it's well in balance, or at least it's not unbalanced. That's more important, that, because, once the system is in balance, some sort of concert of nations has been established. There is balance. Nobody's dominating it. Before that, once they're warring states trying to augment their status, increase their sphere of influence, that's also acceptable. That's not a problem, as long as one of those states is not about to dominate, say, the entirety of Europe from Portugal to the Urals. That's also fine. So that spells a lot of trouble for us, for the Poles. And then the third, of course, and people usually are very critical of isolationism, but because of the arguments you've raised, the US being pretty much self-contained, able to, after a period of painful readjustment, but able to function without significant interaction with the rest of the world, defended by two oceans, and having nuclear weapons, that really puts it in a fairly safe position, even if somebody, and that's very unlikely because, again, anti-hegemonic coalitions will form, even without the United States, they will form. It's an alluring proposition to just ignore the rest of the world. With the nuclear weapons, with the protection guaranteed by Navy and nuclear weapons, and self-sufficiency.
Yeah, space assets for long.
Not a bad option at all. I don't think they would go
Not
there.
a bad options. But I think that isolationism in its pure form, and I interpret it narrowly, has never happened basically since the United States entered the world stage around the First World War. I think in the interwar period there was no isolationism, as cliche goes, but it was rather offshore balancing as well. Because they had interests in Europe, and they thought that their interests were served best by withdrawing troops from Europe and withdrawing political maneuvering from Europe.
I mean, but it's a strong tendency. Look, after Second World War, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that NATO will be formed. They didn't want to, they were looking to demobilize. Uncle Joe kind of pushed them towards that direction.
Well, but they didn't withdraw from Asia.
Again?
The United States didn't withdraw from Asia.
From Asia, sure.
And its interest in Asia, and basically an interest in China and its role in the uneasiness of Japanese aggression. So the Europeans were handling the Hitler guy, but the Americans were preoccupied with the Japanese, growing. So basically, and there was, Philippines and the bases there, and the Guam, and all this thing, and the influence upon the Dutch power also to cut commodities to Japan, Indochina. The Americans had influence in Asia, and so they were not isolated politically.
Sure, but then if you look at the stretch of almost 150 years between the moment in 1800 when the treaty with France was disbanded and formation of NATO, the US has not entered a single military alliance. There wasn't so majority of its history has been lived in a more restrained mode rather than the one we know and love today. And I'm not saying this ironically, we really did love this period. And then, the third question is, what will the allies do? And basically, it's a three-pronged solution between loyalty, hedging, and exit. Or, whether they will be looking to appease, to bandwagon with because we're talking about US allies, the ones threatened by potential aggression from US adversary and that country's adversary. So you're either looking at a situation where those countries would be willing to bandwagon, which is rare. It doesn't happen. Surprisingly, it doesn't happen a lot. When it comes to Nixon, what Nixon did in 1969, it was, I believe, 25th of July, 5 days after Apollo 11 mission, by the way, Jacek.
Yeah, cool.
Was basically, he said the US will expect its allies to play the primary role in their defense. This is what he said. The US is overstretched. It was, the background was obviously looking to disengage from the Vietnam War. But what it meant in practice, what Nixon telegraphed, was that they will be looking to cut their assets, limit their exposure to potential wars. And countries reacted very differently to this. For example, South Korea was looking to autonomize their capabilities. They started developing nuclear weapons. They were also looking to draw the US in. For example, they kind of They were forced to engage with North Koreans. Interestingly, they had to, because that's what Nixon expected from President Park back then of South Korea. But they were doing this only as a token gesture. They weren't really looking to score any substantial agreement with the North Koreans. And at the same time, they were looking to augment their own and autonomize their own capabilities. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it was the polar opposite. But the interesting case was Thailand, which was rabidly anti-communist back in the day, and yet sought to ameliorate its relationship with People's Republic of China because of threat of the abandonment. Japan felt safe. For some reason, Japan felt that the relationship between itself and the United States is solid enough to continue, as it were. Didn't really, and they also didn't. I don't believe they were so much threatened by the Chinese, and rather felt the threat from the Russians, which made it easier to swallow Nixon's speech, because Nixon's speech meant that the US will be looking to have a detente of sorts with the Chinese. So the Japanese didn't really do much, and Australians were far away, first of all, and second of all, they try to augment local, regional security architecture while being hopeful that the US will keep course at the end of the day. So they kind of hedged a little. Remember, the Australians had their own nuclear weapons program a bit earlier, I believe, 50s and 60s, but they did. So basically, this is you can try to focus more on local, regional security architecture, augment your own capabilities, looking to autonomize, bandwagon, or remain loyal. The question is what will, and again, this really depends on how proximate is the threat and how serious is the threat, and how the elite judges the links between the patron and the client state. It's going to be very interesting. I mean, I say this as somebody interested in strategy rather than somebody who lives in Warsaw and might get Iskandered, any minute once the order falls apart. But from that detached perspective, it's going to be very interesting to see how countries react to the threat of abandonment or more restrained US.
Just to ending our conversation, I would provocatively suggest that Poland would stick to the United States even at the risk of being exposed to even war, and try to expand its military posture, and so create some regional alliances with Sweden and the United States being offshore balancer.
Yeah.
Germany will band the wagon, damn sure, because they need Russia for their economy, and they will need the Chinese markets and the Chinese technology as well. In the long run, it will backfire, but that's what they will do. That's why there will be a major tension within the European Union reform. What the European Union is going to be for, about, and what the United States is going to play vis-a-vis. So there will be an internal discussion between member states. What US is for European Union, what Russia is for European Union, and that's going to be hell of a road. Basically, the intermarium countries will rebel against Germany and France, seeing eye to eye with Russia and stuff. And I also think that in Asia, this will be a major dynamics, much of it depending on how the Chinese are going to play the hand. So we will see. I think the confrontation is coming, and it is sooner than I expected in my previous books. Somewhere around after elections in the US, tensions will grow so high that any Sarajevo incident will be quite probable. And we'll see. Maybe we'll continue discussing it in another podcast of ours.
We could ask a question what Poland should do. And it's a very simple answer: hedge, look for local arrangements, and hedge in nuclear realm as well.
Let's talk about it in the next one. Thank you, Albert. Albert Świdziński, Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. Stay with us for more strategic thoughts. Take care.